Hello and welcome to Define American with Jose Antonio Vargas. I'm Jose. Did you know that undocumented immigrants from Asia are the fastest growing undocumented population in the United States? However, the mainstream narrative almost exclusively focuses on the southern border and the Latine community. Latine, Hispanic, Latino community. As of 2017, there were roughly 1.7 million undocumented Asian immigrants in the United States. This means, numbers wise, about one out of every six undocumented immigrants in the United States are Asian. One out of every seven Asian immigrants is undocumented. According to Pew, the Pew Research Center, some 54% of the 24 million Asian American living in the United States are immigrants. Among Asian adults, that share rises to 67%. In other words, Asian people in this country are actually more immigrant than any other racial group in America. But if you read the news or watch the news or listen to the news, that's not a reality that you often hear. And the United States government has an ugly history with regard to targeting Asian immigrant communities, especially during wartime or when there are international hostilities. Donald Trump, before he takes his second term, has specifically targeted Chinese immigrants, vowing to focus on deporting military-age men from China, and has suggested that they're trying to raise an army to fight the United States from the inside.
They're coming in from China, 32,000 over the last few months, and they're all military age, and they mostly are men. And it sounds like to me, are they trying to build a little army in our country? Is that what they're trying to do?
I have to say, as a Filipino American, and all the messages that I get, if you see a person who look like this, but whose name is Jose Antonio Vargas, it means they're Filipino. There's 4.5 million of us in this country, so you probably should know that, right? As a Filipino immigrant in this country who's Asian American, as an Asian American, I've always felt like we're kind of the third stool in America's three-legged stool when it comes to racial relations. There are white people, there are black people, we know about Latinos, but the Asian people, as part of the three-legged stool, where are they? Where do they fit? So this conversation that we're having right now for this episode is actually all about Asian immigrants and then the undocumented Asian population. And my guests today are Bethany Li, the Executive Director of the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Jo-Ann Yoo, Executive Director of the Asian American Federation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Same.
I'm just going to get started, and this is really for both of you. I actually want to start, and Jo-Ann, we were texting about this, and it was interesting on the email. You said something like you actually brought up the Clinton era. And sometimes when it comes to, I think, to immigration, we have collective historical amnesia. We think everything started with Trump, when in reality, Clinton, Bush, Obama. I want to actually start with your own personal history, immigrant history, and why you do this work. And Jo-Ann, I want to start with you.
Sure. I'll try to tell you my story without having to cry. I am very much a very proud immigrant. I came here when I was 9 from Korea. My parents came here because they had 3 daughters. They were very much the middle class, upper middle class in Korea, and they gave it all away because they knew that they had to come here to give the 3 of us, the 3 daughters, an educational opportunity. They came here with resources. They came here with some money. So our immigration story is a little different, but they started from the bottom like everybody else. My mother, who was very much a society lady in Korea, started working at a factory for Hewlett Packard. My father was an English major in college, started to wash dishes and did construction work. The story of, and for me, as one of the very first English-speaking kids in my community in Colorado, I was the language broker. I tell people, I know what this work feels like. I know what kids are going through because we were the kids who had to navigate the American system without the native language or the English vocabulary to be able to help our families and our communities. I remember going to translate to help people apply for food stamps, to translate for victims of domestic violence, to go through to doctor's offices. And sometimes I feel like I ended up in New York to run away from all of that. And here I am having to do this on a much larger scale. But because I have experienced that and I understand what it's like to not understand the language, not understand the system, not having to fill out parents' permission slips for their kids. When I was a child myself, I know what that feels like. And yet here I am over 50 years later being an American, a very proud American. And I do say, I can't believe I'm still doing this shit. I can't believe things have not been fixed. And we are working on the exact same thing I experienced when I was a 9-year-old child.
Thank you, Jo-Ann. I'll definitely have a couple of follow-up questions I want to ask you. I want to turn to Bethany now. Please, Bethany, tell us, like, why do you do this work and what's that personal connection?
Mainly because of my grandparents. When we talk about our immigration story, in some sense for me, it starts with my grandparents because my grandfather was the first one really to settle here in his family after many, many years. So, same with my great grandfather. And my understanding of it is that my family came as a result of being a descendant of paper sons.
Oh,
My sister did a little bit of history searching, and that seems to be why my great grandfather and my grandfather were able to come to the United States initially, and eventually my grandfather brought my mom's entire family over, and so I grew up with them helping to raise us, and in the with them in all of the different, in some sense, stereotypical jobs that we know of when we think about Chinese immigrants, right? They worked in restaurants, they worked as seamstresses, they, you know, were in laundry, in dry cleaners. And actually, what I found really interesting was that not until I started representing workers in a garment factory case in New York several years ago did I find out that my grandmother had also worked for 6 months in one of those same garment factories in New York. I hadn't even realized she'd had a connection to New York because it came through Chicago.
given this, how personal this work is, Jo-Ann, I was really struck by what you said about here you are 50 years later, and how do you, what's the rationale in your head about why we haven't moved any further?
I think it's because we are plagued with the dual negativity of the model minority myth, but also as the perpetual foreigners. Like, I want to tell, you know, the empire, you can't have us both ways. We are Americans of Asian descent, and we are proudly bring our traditions and cultures here to lend to the uniqueness of what America is. But you use us to oppress other communities of color, and
Hmm.
then you also tell us we can't have things because they're suspicious of who we are. You can't have it both ways. The reality is, we are exactly what you said in the intro. Our community is complex, but we are also very proud, and we are very proud Americans. And so, having to, force us to be pigeonholed into, all of these things that the empire sees who we are is really unfair. And I think that's why things aren't moving. And this is why I think folks like me and Bethany and thousands of other advocates continue to be out there having to tell our stories and having to push back against narratives that keep our community down, and it prevents us from making real progress.
One follow-up right away, Jo-Ann, is I think it's important to unpack when you use the word empire, right? That's not a term that's commonly used in
I
talking
use it.
about. Yeah. So can you explain a little bit why, when you say the empire, what are you referring to exactly?
Because I think about the American system, the political structure, and I think very few people who look like us have made it through. But I think the reality is it still is, the system is designed to, is a gatekeeping system that keeps us out. It is not a I remind young people, I remind other communities of color leaders and young people, the system was not designed with us in common. The system was never designed to think, to to see our advancement. There's, yes, there's a lot of great uh, Asian American leaders who are in the political forefront. We've made in entertainment. There's a lot of advancements we have made. But you know what? We have a long way to go until we are fully represented. And so for me, it is a system that has yet to fully acknowledge every participant in this country. And so it is an empire, and it has the full force to be able to determine who gets rights, who doesn't. Obviously, Asian Americans, we play a very weird role in this country. And so for me, I remind everybody this system was never designed with us in mind. And so we have to keep that in mind. And what we need to push back is the empire that makes us still work on language access and cultural relevance at 50 years after getting here.
I was wondering if I could add to that, because I think this reference to empire directly relates to why we have immigration and migration, and why we see the populations that we have coming into our country, right? When we talk about the largest refugee population in the United States, that's the Southeast Asian refugee population. And why? That's directly because of empire, with the United States having been in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, right? And during the war. And that is why we have this group of Southeast Asian refugees in the United States in the first place. And that's true kind of continuously of so many different migrants in the United States.
As we're talking about this, I'm realizing this is the kind of context that I did not see brought up at all during this election, right? And when people ask me, I'll never forget, I was doing an event in North Carolina. This was like, I don't know, 10 years ago. And when I said that there are 2 million Filipinos, I think something like 2 million Filipinos in California, right? Where I'm from, where I grew up. And I remember a guy at the very back of the room, it was a big ballroom, says, "Why are there so many of you here?" So clearly he had never had Filipino food. you know. And then I said, "Sir, we are here because you were there." He's like, "What?" "I'm here because you took the Philippines. When you took Puerto Rico, that was when you took the Philippines after the Spanish-American War." And he was like, "What are you talking about?" So then I said, so not only do I have to explain why I'm undocumented, I have to explain to you the history about your country that you don't even know. And I think that context of empire building, the impact of not only America as an empire, but what colonization has done in many parts of Asia, it's just not part of the language around immigration and around race in this country. And speaking of that, Bethany, I really want to turn to you because, Donald Trump, before he takes office a second time, has targeted Chinese immigrant communities. And we know that he targeted Chinese immigrant communities during his first term, right, with the China Initiative targeting alleged spies. And lately, very recently, he has been focusing on Chinese men of so-called military age. Why do you think he's targeting the Chinese American community and undocumented Chinese immigrants?
I mean, it's nonsensical. I think this idea of targeting Chinese men of military age, what does that even mean, right? But like, what I think it really does is that it just creates this like imagery of us being at war with China, right? When earlier when you were talking about the way in which our communities are being impacted here in the United States, when we have supposed foreign conflict, international issues, right? And that is, I think, how we're seeing it play out in Donald Trump's language, because it's not surprising, first of all, that he's targeting China. We saw exactly what he did in his first term. And the way in which he's tying it directly to immigration in a nonsensical way when he talks about enforcement is also not surprising. But what that's going to mean for our communities is that we're going to see additional uptick in violence.
And this community, of course, that is still experiencing, anti-hate attacks in many parts of the country, right? And Jo-Ann, I want to bring you on, paint us a picture of what you think, and you just gave kind of this, what was happening 50 years ago, where we are now. What are the biggest challenges you think facing the Asian immigrant community in this second Trump era?
Oh, what a loaded question. When people ask me about the anti-Asian violence that we all had to endure in very graphic detail. It was, in everybody's living room through media. People said, what's it like to see violence in your own community? And I have to remind people, this country's history with Asian Americans is nothing but violence. It's about excluding us. It's about the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's about Japanese internment. It's about after 9/11 rounding, surveillance of Muslim communities, assumptions that everybody was guilty, and then I, you know, let's let's call it out. Let's call the truth out. It was Trump who insisted on calling it China virus and Wuhan flu, which literally put a target on all our backs. Um, and the question that we led the response, called Hope Against Hate, to be able to help victims, but also to educate our community about how to keep themselves safe. It was the most heartbreaking thing, and I think people don't understand what it's like to see an 85-year-old grandmother taking a safety defense class, walking to the park with a cane because she wanted to be able to go outside once in a while, and she wanted to be able to protect herself. And what does that mean? And what does that speak about humanity? That it still pains me tremendously about the story about that 90-year-old grandmother who got set on fire by two kids in her neighborhood, and she was afraid to tell her own kids. And a couple days later, she went to her senior center and said, "What just happened to me a couple days ago." It's This is what's coming. There were a lot of really horrific policies that impacted not just Asian Americans, but everybody. I feel like what's going to happen with Trump 2.0 is they're going to refine that because they know what mistakes they made. They know how the advocates push back. And so I think they're going to come back stronger. They're going to come back meaner, and they're going to come back, and it's going to be brutal. It's already happening. We are still starting to see, it's just shameless displays of xenophobia, and it's not even microaggressions, it's just all out there. We're starting to see that this is exactly what we were afraid of, and it's already arrived. It's emboldened racists to be able to say whatever they want, to be able to target us, to harm us, and that's exactly what we're afraid of. And we knew what was going to happen, and here we are, and we are bracing ourselves for impact.
And what does that kind of preparation, Bethany, especially given your work um, at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, like what does preparation look like for this moment? How are we, and again, this is an important point to note, the Asian American community is certainly not a monolith. If anything, it's one of the greatest experiments in the history of this country. You have 24 million people from at least 21 different countries, Chinese, Filipinos, Koreans, Indian, right? We come from so many different groups, and here in this country, we're Asian American, right? We're this one thing. So we're not a monolith. However, given what Jo-Ann just laid out, what does preparation look like for our community, given how immigrant our community is?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, this contrast between we're not a monolith, and I think the number one thing that has come up in talking about what people are most fearful of in this upcoming administration is deportation. I think in every single community, every single Asian community that I've talked to, that has been the number one issue, right? And so, what does that mean in terms of preparation? I think there's a lot of different things. Among them are like very obviously know your rights campaigns and materials, because even when there are materials out there, especially when put out, by city or states, more often than not, it's not targeted at our communities because of the wide range, because we're not a monolith. And admittedly, it is difficult in terms of language access, reach, and all those types of things. But we need to do better. Because even when we talk about a place like New York City, right? Or New York, the top number of asylum seekers in New York. Guess what it is? Guess what the population is at 80,000.
What is it?
Chinese. It's Chinese population at 80,000. Second highest asylum seeking population in New York, Indian. So we're talking about Asian populations that are the top two asylum seekers in New York. Yet, if you go out and look at the resources that are out there, they're not available in the same way that they're available in other languages, right? And so one of the things we're also doing is trying to make sure that immigrants are prepared with their records. We have a FOIA tool on our website that allows people to go and request their records from a number of different agencies so that when people are facing deportation, if they're facing raids in their communities, what they do is you can just take those records to an immigration attorney and uh, and obviously finding an immigration attorney is a whole other issue, right? But
Whole other issue.
we could spend a whole episode on it. But you take those records and you're already starting with a leg up because that attorney is able to mine those records for possibilities for stopping your deportation case.
Bethany, can you unpack a little bit just to make sure for our viewers and our listeners, when you say explaining what a FOIA is and where can they find that on your website?
Yeah, so FOIA is a Freedom of Information Act. You make that type of request, and obviously you can get a whole bunch of things. In this particular situation, you're asking a bunch of different agencies for your immigration records. On our website, you can go to aldef.org, so AALDEF.org/resources. And then I think it's /FOIA, but there's also a little drop down where you can see the FOIA tool. It's great. I love it because you don't even have to know what agency to search for. You just go through a series of prompts. It asks you how you came through the United States, all these different things, and then it spits out the agencies that you need to request records from and gives a step-by-step of how to do it.
Thank you for spelling that out. We're going to make sure that we have that on our on the description of this interview, and because I think that's going to be a really useful resource.
And then another form of preparation we're doing is really making sure organizations that are on the front lines are protected. What does that mean? There are already a couple bills in Congress, one of which recently passed, HR 9495, that is called the Nonprofit Killer Bill, right? And that's targeting any organization that is so-called terrorist serving, right? That we know can be, that word we know can be weaponized. We know that there's another bill that is going after organizations that serve undocumented communities. That's pretty much all of our organizations, right? And so what are the things that organizations that can do to protect themselves so that when they're the ones, right, when we are the ones out there on the front lines, we're not also worrying about our foundations actually being attacked.
And Jo-Ann, now you referred to it as Trump 2.0. I'm curious at the Asian American Federation, what is your organization doing to prepare for this time, for this era?
I think we are, what Bethany's saying, we are already seeing, the House Bill 94, 95, things like that coming through, and we're starting to prepare. We're reminding our member agencies the importance of keeping their 501c3 status, nonpartisan work. There's a lot of reminders going on. We're doing a lot of trainings with our member agencies about good record keeping to make sure that if anything happens and if they get in trouble, that they're going to come out of audits and investigations. Okay, we know that many of us work with vulnerable populations. What does that mean for them? We have to get people ready. We also have to get information ready. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I think there is quiet panic among our community right now. And we need to be able, and because of all the language and cultural diversity of our community, we can't just do it in English. We've got to do it in many, many, many languages, and we've got to do it as many times as people need to hear it. We can't panic. We've got to be very methodical. We've got to be able to work together and to be able to get people information that they need. So that is what we're preparing for. We are mining information. I've been telling every organization, don't recreate the wheel. There's plenty of materials out there. We just need to pull things together that we need.
Can you please repeat that part? Do not reinvent the wheel.
Exactly. Don't write new things because there's plenty of stuff out there. What we need to do is to use the materials out there and to be able to share that. So that's exactly what we're doing. Staff members are pulling together know your rights information from groups like the New York Immigration Coalition, and that's the tried and true method. And so, what we can add is to be able to translate that into all the various languages that our community speaks, at least 8 to 10 languages, to be able to distribute that, to be able to, we're thinking about all the other, all the different institutions that normally don't get outreach to, like small businesses. What happens when something happens to your employees? We're also working with employees of small businesses. What happens if somebody asks you for immigration status? What does all that mean? We're trying to help our communities truly know what their rights are, so that way they can keep themselves safe. And it's a daunting task. First and foremost, we keep saying, everybody keep calm, everybody keep calm. Panic will not help us. The reality is that there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And for us, the challenge is, how do we battle misinformation? It's on on so many different channels, WeChat, Kakao Talk, WhatsApp. It's all out there. And the shame of all of it is, this is where, when you are going through a, you know, something urgent happening, then you realize all the investments that nobody's making in your community. So how do we battle misinformation when we have no resources? We're literally fighting with both hands tied behind our backs. Who is giving us resources to be able to get information out there, the right information out there to folks, to be able to uh, not be afraid, to not panic, not have a knee-jerk reaction to what they're hearing, um, and that we want to tell people there is going to be help available. We are working on that help. We are talking to legal services organization. We are prepared to step in to support community members who need it. And but like I said, how do you battle all this misinformation when you don't have the resources?
And this is a perfect opportunity to highlight. Of course, you can go on this episode in the description. These are two organizations that need support, and we should be supporting, right? Both the Asian American Federation and the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Now, let me ask a couple of questions. Let's paint a broader picture here. When I hear you say this, because of the model minority myth, people don't know that the income gap among the AAPI Asian American community is actually the widest out of any of the groups, right? Very poor, and all you have to do is look around your own community, may it be San Francisco, New York, Chicago, right? Where you see, upwardly mobile Asian American professionals, and you see, often elderly, multi-generational Asian American families in Chinatowns or in other places, right? And you see the income gap. Can you talk to us about that need philanthropically? Like, how would you explain to someone, why is this community that people think have so much money, right? What's the disconnect between that and what goes to philanthropy and to do this, to have the resources to do this work?
Thank you for uplifting AALDEF and the Federation. We do need a lot of resources, because I think people don't understand what it takes to even produce, a couple of things to be able to share with resources.
Mhm.
And thank you for talking about our poverty. I think that's something that
We never
doesn't
talk
get,
about.
we don't talk about that. I think everybody, it's the model minority myth. Everybody does, you guys do well, right? And plenty of people in our own community drink that Kool-Aid. Why would we ask for help when we're doing well? And we are a census information center at the Federation. We have the numbers and we say we are not doing well. In New York, Asian seniors are the fastest growing senior population, but they're also the poorest. Through the Asian American disaggregated data, the poorest New Yorkers are from our community. The population with the lowest high school graduation rate is from our community. We need to be able to continue to tell the story, but I also feel like we don't get our share of the foundation dollars. We don't get our share of government funding, um, because people think you guys do okay. You don't need help because you're going to survive without the help that you need, because you're going to keep your head down because you don't complain. The model minority myth. That is what is hindering from support from happening. And here we are trying to calm our community through, a very fearful part of this country's history, and yet where's the resource coming our way? And it's very hard to be able to get philanthropic and corporate dollars to be able to even do something as innocuous, as beneficial as a one-page flyer about, just basic information about know your rights. Even, the conversation is around denaturalization. That has green card holders and citizens spooked too. And
Yep.
so how are we need to get that information out there. Don't worry, calm down. But how are we communicating that without the resources that we need and combating the endless misinformation bots? Like, it is just we are all literally, all the nonprofits on the ground trying to keep people fed in their homes. Meanwhile, the Herculean task of getting accurate information out there. Some days it is hard to get out of bed because we are literally Sisyphus pushing that rock up that hill all the time.
I also think with the model minority myth, considering the whole good, bad immigrant imagery, right, is really important in how we're responding to what that means. Because it's funny, I work with immigrants who are kind of cast as the bad immigrant all the time, and there's always the tendency to be like, oh, it doesn't matter if I have a criminal record. I came in here legally, so like it's those undocumented immigrants that are the problem, right? And then undocumented immigrants I'm working with who are like, oh, but what about those people who have criminal records, right? And so it kind of like goes back and forth in terms of who's the better immigrant. And unfortunately, the model minority myth plays into those stereotypes. And so to the extent that we have narratives that allow us to not play into that, right? And also we create a broader multiracial coalition when we talk about what it will mean to be not racist in the Asian American community, not anti-Black, right? And vice versa, and how all that plays together, then that will be an important part of how we move forward in fighting the Trump administration, and not just the Trump administration, but really the word from earlier, fighting empire, right?
And also, and I'm glad you mentioned, how do we not succumb to the model minority myth and succumb to anti-blackness in which this country was built? And then also, how about making sure that we're not being anti-Latino? One of the things that I had to really deal with when I first started doing this work were some Filipino relatives who were, for whatever reason, anti-Mexican. And I'll never forget, one of my uncles turned to me, "Why are you doing this for Mexican people?" And I was like, "Uncle, what are you talking about? You live next to Mexican people." Like, what? Like, I was just so surprised that my uncle had these kinds of thoughts that I did not know. Because I think sometimes we tend to meld people of color together as if it's one big thing, right? Without trying to understand not only the complexity, but as much as we talk about immigrants, there's racial components to a lot of this. And now, one thing that I want to bring up to both of you, given this election that we had just experienced and lived through, what was it like having immigration be kind of the central issue? Having a South Asian woman be a candidate for president in the Democratic Party, and yet immigration was this hot lumpia, hot dumpling, like, no, whatever we get. It just was not. Asian American and Asian American immigrants were not a part of the narrative at all when immigration, very rarely was it a part of kind of the national narrative during the campaign season. What was that like?
I mean, immigration was a central issue in a terrible way on both
Terrible
sides,
way.
right? Like, so
Yeah.
you had the Trump administration, the Trump people calling for mass deportations, but then you had the Harris people calling for a border plan and a deportation plan that mirrored Trump's border and deportation plan. So what are we talking about here, right? I mean, when we're talking about what are the differences, and how are we creating a more inclusive and welcoming America? That's certainly not it.
Yeah, and I think when you started, Jose, the question is about, Republican immigration policy is bad. Democrat immigration policy is good. That's not true. That, both parties use immigration as a wedge, and they have used us many, many times repeatedly in various ways. I was watching a YouTube video of Reagan and Bush debating about immigration reform when they were running against each other. And if you close your eyes and you didn't realize who was debating, you could swear that it was the Democrats, like what we perceive are Democrats' more generous policy.
We're creating a whole society of really honorable, decent, family-loving people that are in violation of the law, and secondly, we're exacerbating relations with Mexico.
Rather than making them or talking about putting up a fence, why don't we work out some recognition of our mutual problems, make it possible for them to come here legally with a work permit, and then while they're working and earning here, they pay taxes here. And when they want to go back, they can go back, and they can cross and open the border both ways.
They talked about bringing people out of the shadows. They talked about, what do we do about supporting undocumented immigrants who've been here forever and ever and ever, right? I don't think good immigration policy belongs to any single party. And I think that is a come to Jesus conversation that both parties will need to have. Our country is turning, the children of immigrants are expanding and we're growing. And they're gonna, if both parties want to grow and retain their power, they're gonna need to figure out how to engage us in the way that we want to be engaged. They need to acknowledge who we are. And so, I don't think, this immigration policy makes sense because that's a Democratic policy. There are Democratic policies that have harmed us. Look at the 96 welfare reform that Bill Clinton signed, right? Like, what I remember is the panic in the community, same type of panic. And I remember in the ethnic papers, my mom telling me, in some of the bigger cities, a lot of seniors who relied on public benefits, now that this law has kicked in, they're panicking. And there was a lot of suicides because they didn't know what to do and they didn't know how to survive. This is what panic does. And so, Clinton, everybody loves President Clinton, because of the welfare, but I remember welfare reform. I remember immigration reform. I know what that looks like. I know what harm that had on our community. And I think one party is good for immigration, one party is bad for immigration. I reject that notion. I think both parties need to do better by immigrants because this country was built on the backs of immigrants and they have to acknowledge that.
Being in Chicago for the Democratic National Convention, as as Kamala Harris was accepting the nomination, and the first day of the convention, actually this is in one of our episodes that we had recorded last week. The first day of the convention, there was a whole panel on the state of immigration reform. They Forward at Us hosted this panel. They got a ballroom, right, at the convention center. Big ballroom, maybe 500 people. It could hold 500 people. About 15 people showed up on the first day of the convention. And that's when I was like, oh gosh.
Because you know what? That is the state of immigration reform. Like
that is immigration reform. That is the state. And again, what I'm getting at here, and let me unpack it a little bit more. When I first started doing this work 13 years ago, I would be in many rooms when immigration reform was being discussed, and I would be the only Asian person in the room. And then I realized that they invited me because my name was Jose Antonio Vargas, and so they kept trying to like make me a part. And so I said, where's AALDEF? Where's Asian Advancing Justice? Where's the Asian Law Caucus? Like, again, this has been framed, and you can see the numbers, as a Latinx, Hispanic, Latino issue, and the Asian community feels rather marginal. how would you contextualize that? And again, this was my experience 13 years ago. Is it any better now?
No, I think that's absolutely right, right? When I talk about how, the top two groups of asylum seekers in New York are from Asian countries, yet there are no resources aimed at them, really. Like, that's the state of what people think about Asian immigrants, right? And whether or not we exist. Similarly, and 13 years ago, I actually remember you kind of working with some of our undocumented youth group members
Oh yeah.
in New York, RAISE, the Revolutionizing Asian Immigrant Stories on the East Coast, right? And it was so moving to me to be able to be in that space with them, because so many of them for the first time said for the first time it was the only space they'd ever been in with so many other undocumented Asian immigrants, right? And Asian immigrant youth, because many of the spaces, even if they had been organizing beforehand, were primarily Spanish speakers. And so,
Yeah.
a very different experience, despite the fact that they also came from so many different countries.
And we have to acknowledge that in New York, the other growing immigrant population is the African immigrant population.
Oh
And
yes.
so, the faces of the immigrant population is incredibly diverse. And I'm so proud to work with the African immigrant community, the Latino immigrant community, and I have to jokingly tell my friends who work in the immigrant rights field for the Latino community, sorry you have to hold up all of this by yourselves, because we don't even get to participate, and this is all on you guys. I'm so sorry about that. But that's also a disservice to us too. If you think about, in New York City, we have the asylum seeker, the so-called migrant crisis, and the unregistered people who've come through the southern borders and through Canada. They're Asians. China and India, they're coming through the borders. Same thing happening to everybody else. They're doing that. And so, I think for the Asian American community, now that the president-elect has named that he is going to start to um, enforce, and have sweeps. And he has named the Chinese community, that the of military serving age. Now that he has named the community, I think that's where the panic is starting. And now I think the community is realizing, no, we cannot fly under the radar anymore. And this is an opportunity for us to stand up and to be able and stand up, be counted, and to be able to support each other. But also, this is also an incredible opportunity for us to work with other immigrant communities to be able to say we are all in the same boat, and we all have to support each other and push back together against bad policy.
I just have to say, in terms of the targeting, in the Filipino community, some tweets were going out. I actually have one in front of me right now. One of the conservative anti-immigrant influencers tweeted this out, and I got tagged a lot. And it said the Philippines is now urging its 300,000 illegals living in the U.S. to self-deport ASAP, or risk being deported and banned from the country for 10 years. The message is getting out. Good. And then somebody tagged me. Can they make sure to take their fellow illegal Jose's writing with them, please? I had at least 20 of this literally tagging me. And of course, because it's social media, it gets to my Lola's inbox. So my Lola's asking me, what's going on? And then I have to tell her, Lola, like, that's grandmother in Tagalog. Lola, I'll be okay. I have lawyers. I'll be okay. And I'm saying this to talk about mental health, which I think, Jo-Ann, something that I'm really glad that you talk about, and Bethany does as well. So when people talk about immigration, it's often very removed, right, from the human impact of aggressive deportation, enforcement, and xenophobia, and all the rhetoric that we've been hearing. Could you talk, Jo-Ann, about the importance of access to mental health for people experiencing this kind of trauma?
Absolutely. I don't think it's immigrants. I think it's everybody. I feel like, especially after COVID, it's the entire world. And I have told the Biden White House, this is the next major health crisis that this country is going to face and that we are facing. And now with all of all the rhetoric that we had to deal with, all the negativity and the toxicity during the election season, people are feeling some kind of way. And now there's this fear of possible deportation, family separation, families trying to figure out, mixed status families are trying to figure out what do we do. it's got to take a toll on you. It's got to be, you're living in a pressure cooker. But our community, we don't talk about these things. But also, even if you wanted to get help, there isn't help available because because we don't have therapists and professionals who speak our languages. 85% of the mental health providers in this country are white. Something that I have been working on for years with the Black and Latino community. The, the help available are, the experts do not look like us. So that's why we don't access that. But we also all deal with the stigma, the shame, don't tell anybody what's going on. But I can only imagine what the conversations in some of these households are, what it must be like, and the fear they have, the anxiety they have. How do they send their kids to school? It's the exact same conversation when I asked one of my friends who accepted a lot of asylum seeker families, and he runs a school, and he said, "Do you know what it's like when I'm watching little kids who've never been to school before, who came to came through the southern border, and I see them sitting there looking out the window thinking, whenever I go back to my shelter, will my family be there?" That anxiety, that is a ripple, that is a common thread among immigrant families, but also Americans. If you think about everything that we've had to endure and everything that we had to listen to, just some of it was just garbage and it was horrible, but it is hard to shut out. And that's what we are having to unpack right now. And I think right now, and for the Asian American community, that was compounded by all the violence, all the, anti-Asian hate, watching people who look like us get killed, get smashed on the sidewalk, get pushed on the subways. What that must be like, thinking, if I go out, am I going to be targeted next? All of this. I think it's so much that more than we can possibly endure, and yet there's so little help available right now, and that is something that the Federation's working very hard on. We put together for New York City mental health resources. You can go to our website and you can check out the directory. You can type in your insurance, or if you don't have insurance, in the language in the neighborhood, and you will get somebody that you can go talk to. We need to start to do this together, and we need to start to normalize what it's like to talk about how we're feeling and the depression and the anxieties that we're all expressing right now.
During the first Trump administration, I represented a Cambodian person who was deported before his second kid was born. His wife was pregnant with her second child. And eventually, we were actually able to bring him back from deportation. It was exciting right before the pandemic. His family was able to greet him and the entire community at the airport. But to give a sense of the range of mental health needs and issues that even just that one family was dealing with. This man was in Cambodia, cut off from his entire network, spent most of his time in Cambodia on FaceTime for as long as he possibly could with his wife and his young daughter and the new baby, right? Just to kind of feel some sort of connection to his world, his home. The wife herself faced eviction several times as a result of losing additional income, and ended up having to move in with different family members. And even now, after he's back, he has had difficulty finding a therapist, right? And this is someone who escaped the genocide in Cambodia initially, witnessed really horrific violence and deaths as a child. And then, as with much of the Southeast Asian population, were resettled in low-income neighborhoods and experienced what we now call bullying in schools and other places, right? But that wasn't part of the nomenclature then. And so you think about this, kind of multiple waves of trauma on top of the fact that there's multi-generational trauma in his family, parents, all that type of stuff, right? Yet it's still really, really hard for him to find a therapist.
When anti-China, anti-immigrant, anti-Asian rhetoric, as it increases, how can communities and states respond in ways that actually can make people safer?
I think it's an important question because I think we're at a crossroads at how to respond. I think once we saw the uptick in anti-Asian violence during the first Trump administration, we saw a lot of states and cities responding, and the federal government responding in a way that that introduced bills that actually increased sentencing and expanded the definition of hate crime of crimes under hate crime laws, and that actually can be a problem for communities of color because hate crimes laws actually, like many other laws, kind of issues with the criminal legal system, disproportionately impact people of color in terms of prosecution. And so you kind of get the opposite effect of what maybe the intention was. And so I think when I say we're at a crossroads, I think we need to do better this time. If we see, and I think we expect to see, unfortunately, an uptick in the anti-China rhetoric that will lead to an uptick in violence, what will it mean for us to respond in a way to make communities safer? And I think that means thinking about ways that don't involve law enforcement in the ways that it has. One great example of what not to do, for example, is the last time what we heard was that plainclothes policemen were going into workplaces that had significant numbers of undocumented workers. That doesn't make undocumented workers feel safer when we're talking about the possible enforcement that might be happening. And so we actually have kind of on the same link on our website, aldef.org/resources, we have an anti-Asian violence toolkit where the first part of it walks people through a bunch of different questions when evaluating policies that are responding to violence in our communities.
We will make sure to have the links to both of your websites available on YouTube and when we share this on the podcast as well on Spotify and Apple. We have two kind of running themes with these episodes. The first is we get lots of audience questions. And so I'm going to ask you a question that we actually got from Instagram, and this is for both of you. And this is in the context of, again, the Asian American immigrant experience. What is one thing most people still misunderstand the most about U.S. immigration policy?
People forget that there was no immigration policy way back when all the white people came through, the Europeans came through. I think some of the policies we have now, it was designed to keep our communities out and to exclude us. And now it's just compounding and it's just become harsher. But the other side of that is we need people, we need workers, we need to have, if you think about the undocumented immigrants who work here, they pay taxes, they contribute to the economy. I don't know what happens when you think that you're going to send them all away. What happens to the economy? I want people to think about that. And I think there's a lot of, I want everybody to think about their own family's immigration history, with ancestry and all of this, DNA testing, and people are always so shocked, like, oh my God, our ancestors are from this little remote region in Europe. Everybody's ancestor is from somewhere else. And so I want people to go back and think about that. There is no, we are Americans. We are all Americans. And for the Asian American community, I want us to be very proud to know that we get the luxury of having dual cultures. We are Americans, but we also get to be fully to be Asian as well. We get to eat all our favorite foods at home, but we also get to be Americans, and we can live in both worlds very, very proudly.
Bethany, what is the one thing most people still misunderstand about U.S. immigration policy?
So this might actually be a more depressing note to end on, but I mean, what I would say is I think that what we forget sometimes is that the immigration policies are the way they are is because it was built to bring in cheap labor. And what I actually just learned this week, kind of fascinating and terrible, but immigration history is actually really fascinating in terms of how we think about our country, right? And so I was just doing a training about the immigration system and how the Department of Homeland Security didn't come into existence until 2003, right, in the post 9/11 period. Many of us know this, and how previously the agency was called INS, Immigration and Naturalization Services, and that was actually kept within the DOJ, the Department of Justice. What I didn't learn until this week was actually up until 1940s, it was in the DOL, the Department of Labor, right? And so that kind of gives you a sense.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, right? Fascinating. So that kind of gives you a sense of what the United States was thinking about immigrants and why they were letting people in.
And again, people want the labor, but I'm not sure they want the people, right? And what do you do with people? And on that note, another recurring theme now are words. I think words matter. I think language matters. And with these two extraordinary activists and advocates as guests today, I thought of Ron Takaki, the great Ronald Takaki. And these words are from his groundbreaking book, Strangers from a Different Shore. The person, by the way, who told me about this book is my friend Michelle Alexander. She wrote a book called The New Jim Crow. And when I told her that I was working on this new book project, she was like, Jose, have you read Ron Takaki? And I was so embarrassed. I was like, no. And so now, after spending 6 hours at the UC Berkeley Ethnic Studies Library, looking at everything Ron Takaki, at all of the folders and the files, I know a lot about Ron Takaki. And these words are from him. The history of Asian Americans teaches us that we hold the future in our hands. The men and women of our story made decisions about their lives and communities, though usually in circumstances not of their choosing. They struggled to change the world around them in order to determine their future. Indeed, throughout history, Asian Americans have been transforming America and also finding themselves being transformed by America. Since the arrival of the first Chinese during the 1849 gold rush, the interaction between Asian Americans and the larger society has been dynamic and dialectical, a continuous rebellion against the exclusive constructions of we the people, and a constant resolve to help make this a more perfect union, an ethnically diverse yet united society. So, in honor of Ron Takaki's words and in honor of both of you, thank you so much for doing the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.